I'm Sarah Solovich from Searchlight, New Mexico, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan investigative news organization based in Santa Fe. And a few of our members are here tonight, so I'd like to ask them to stand up, please. Amy Lynn, Rob Dean, Jan Brooks, and John Roby. We're sponsoring this event with the League of Women Voters, Los Alamos chapter, and the organizers of this evening are Barbara Califf, Becky Shankland, and Carol Neal from the AAUW, or American Women's University Women. So please stand up and be acknowledged. And we also have some student helpers in our midst. Marie Momeka, Gopal Nadiga, Lauren Pogue, and Sophia Feldman. Stand up. Thank you. Our speaker this evening is Charles Sallee, who's the Deputy Director of the State Legislative Finance Committee. And the LFC in New Mexico is really pretty unique in that it's a separate permanent budget committee that presents and comes up with budgets for New Mexico that's completely separate from the governor's budget each year. It's an organization of real professionals who work in a nonpartisan, very independent way. Is that a correct way to phrase it?
Yep.
Okay. Since 2005, Charles has been responsible for conducting and overseeing program evaluations of state agencies, higher education, and public schools. Some of his work has led to major policy changes and cost savings in the areas of Medicaid, higher education, adult and juvenile corrections, public schools, and workers' compensation. He also has experience providing direct human services, including to people with developmental disabilities and abused children. Charles grew up in New Mexico, earned a BSW from New Mexico State University, and MSW in Administration from Texas State University, San Marcos. So welcome everybody, and welcome Charles.
Thank you for having me.
Let me just tell you a little bit about the format of the evening. It'll be presented as a Q&A for about 45 minutes. And then we'll open it up to the audience for questions that will last another 15 minutes or so, after which we'll break down into small group table discussions about what can be done, what we should ask the legislature to do, what we should ask the new governor, whoever it is, and what we should ask the schools. But the focus this evening is really on early childhood education. And I'd like to begin by just asking, why is early childhood so important, and why should we care?
Well, I think we should care because too many of our kids show up to school not ready to learn. Too many of our kids are born into this world with low birth weights and lots of health problems. Too many of our kids are not safe when we send them back home with their parents, and we have very high rates of bad outcomes for too many kids in New Mexico. And often the programs and systems that we've established over the years wait to deal with those problems until they're very expensive and very challenging to solve. How to keep kids in high school when they're already really far behind in school. Those are very expensive interventions. You end up with very expensive spending on our correctional system and certain parts of the healthcare system. And so we know a lot more today than we did 30 or 40 years ago about child development, about brain development, and about a whole suite of programs and interventions that can actually help strengthen families to take care of their kids in a safe, nurturing way so they show up ready to learn at school and get off to a good, healthy start. And over the past, I'd say 15 years, we've learned even more about brain development in very young children prenatally all the way through age 3 to 5. And so governments all across the state, all across the country are trying to organize themselves to figure out how to use these new interventions and new government programs to strengthen kids and spend money early on with prevention and early intervention programs rather than remediation, incarceration, and other kinds of things that are really expensive for taxpayers and don't work very well.
So despite all the programs that we have, and there's just a whole laundry list of programs, there's Firstborn, or as it's also known, home visiting, there's early childhood, there's pre-K, there's childcare. Can you talk a little bit about all these different programs and how they interact, how they work together, and also, do they repeat themselves in some ways? What's their effectiveness and impact?
So each program, the first question that we start with when we're helping the legislature is, what problems are you wanting to solve? Are you wanting to solve problems related to health? And then there's interventions that have good research behind them that can help improve birth outcomes, for example. Are you wanting to solve issues of school readiness and getting kids more prepared cognitively for when they enter school? There's programs that are designed around that. So that's the first kind of question, is lining up these different programs and interventions with the kinds of outcomes that you want to change. And then once you've organized that, there's investment options essentially into different programs. And they range from home visiting services, which is basically an intensive parent education program. Many of you are familiar with Firstborn. There's lots of different types of programs that actually exist. Some of them have really good research behind them, like Firstborn, Nurse Family Partnership. Others don't have research behind them yet. And so we can't speak to what their level of effectiveness is and what kinds of outcomes they'll affect. But they're basically designed to go in and work intensely with families on parent education around health, safety, well-being. You got a baby. Wow, now what? It's pretty overwhelming for any parent to bring a baby home, and you want to do your best. And some families need more support than others. Educationally, we've got very organized interventions that we've created in New Mexico through our pre-K program. So this is trying to emulate basically a preschool program for 4-year-olds, and now we're venturing into 3-year-olds. It's very organized around age-appropriate child development, so you don't have kids lined up in their seats learning the ABCs. You've got play-based approaches to learning that. Find your letter and go sit on it kind of thing. But with those programs, we found they've got positive, lasting academic impacts all the way through 8th grade. We've been tracking cohorts of kids all the way through 8th grade now. The research behind some of these types of programs, and you hear it from Nobel Prize-winning economists about investing in early education pays off 7 to 1, or many of those kinds of cost-benefit ratios. Those were very almost laboratory-developed intervention programs that largely don't exist. Our pre-K program is really good, but it's not the same as the Perry preschool program that was studied and informed a lot of what we know with preschool. Then you've got programs like child care assistance that really grew out of welfare reform, that if we're going to tell poor mothers getting cash assistance, you need to get out of the home and get into the workforce, what do you do with the kids? And so that program came out of giving them vouchers to go and get daycare services. Well, if we're going to have kids in daycare all day because we're telling their moms to work, we better make sure that it's quality daycare and the kids get something out of it. So we've been trying to build equality around that. But that program hasn't shown to impact educational outcomes. So that's what's really important about the question of what outcomes do you want to impact. If people ask me, we want to change educational outcomes, I tell them, put your money into pre-K. If they tell me I want to help families afford child care and income support, put money into child care assistance as the way that it stands. There's other programs that work with families that may have, the kids who may have developmental delays, family, infant, toddlers. They go into the home and work with the families to do developmental screenings. There's nutritional programs that work with new mothers to make sure that the kids have good food to eat, they're taught how to breastfeed, all of those types of things. So there's a range of them, and I brought a handout if people didn't get it before they sat down on a myriad of different program interventions that we've been funding.
I wanted to go back to one of those economists that you mentioned, James Heckman from the University of Chicago. And I'd just like for one moment to quote him, because his research on return on investment and early childhood education has had such an enormous influence nationally. He wrote, "The highest rate of return in early childhood development comes from investing as early as possible from birth through age 5 in disadvantaged families. Starting at age 3 or 4 is too little too late, as it fails to recognize that skills beget skills in a complementary and dynamic way. Efforts should focus on the first years for the greatest efficiency and effectiveness. The best investment is in quality early childhood development from birth to 5 for disadvantaged children and their families." So, as you were speaking, there is this wide range of quality in the programs that we offer in birth to 5. When it comes to home visiting, when it comes to early child care, childhood education, and other programs that simply don't provide an evidence-based curriculum. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. So can you just speak to that? And I mean, you did a little bit already, but why is there such a gap that's been kind of allowed to, to kind of permeate through the state when we know what works and what doesn't?
It's a challenge in most states and where you go in localities that everybody's a unique snowflake. New Mexico is unique. What works elsewhere won't work here. But what we've been doing here hasn't worked. And so maybe we should give it a shot. And that's been a real barrier to getting folks to adopt these evidence-based models, is this notion that we're so different in New Mexico that this can't possibly work here. I think there's real opportunities and conversations that we need to have around how do you adapt some of these curriculum to make them culturally relevant within our state. You don't want to talk about certain things in a parent education program that somebody can't relate to. So you have to be very sensitive to those things. But at the same time, you don't want to take out the core elements of that particular program that actually make it work. And while we know the research around these programs, many of these programs, in their whole work, we're still not quite sure which little elements you can pull out and change, and whether that's the key element that makes it work or not. I mean, there's a lot of social science research behind many of these programs. So folks, in some areas we've allowed them to make it up as we go. And we've tried to track outcomes, and you may not get the outcomes that you want by going down that route. If you don't implement a well-researched program very well, you're not going to get good outcomes either. So you have to really pay attention to both, kind of what's the research behind what you're doing, as well as doing it well.
According to Searchlight's own reporting, only 20% of 3-year-olds and I think 50% of 4-year-olds attend any kind of preschool education. And that includes pre-K or Head Start or early child special education. And that's a lot of children who are being left out around the state, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess I challenge the 4-year-old numbers a little bit more as we use more administrative data to estimate who's getting services and at what level. Because we've made pretty big inroads into 4-year-olds having access to preschool services. 3-year-olds, there's a bigger gap, and there's also bigger questions about, well, what route should we go with 3-year-olds? Think of every age in New Mexico having roughly 25,000 kids. And a couple of years ago, our administrative data, we estimated we were making available enough pre-K slots and high-quality child care assistance, Montessori, NACCE accredited kind of things, and Head Start slots for 70% of low-income kids in the state. So there's a real need for the state as we've been making these investments. You don't want to crowd out programs. You have to have a strategy of what you want to do within each community. And we're getting to the point in some communities where we're likely oversaturating the market. And it's uncoordinated, and it's causing a lot of challenges for providers at a local level. So the state really needs to have a hard conversation about how many kids do we want involved in which programs. And then we can help estimate what that would cost. And there's actually a funders group, a private philanthropy, that's put forward their ideas on that.
So what is the intent going forward? Is it universal, pre-K education? What do you think there
The
should be?
legislature hasn't landed on a target. The executive has not ever put forth a plan for what we should do. And so that's why I think this group of private funders said, well, here's what we think a business model should look like. And then there's also new competing models out there of another group on just pre-K. The business group had a plan for rolling out home visiting as well as pre-K, and also investing in the workforce. You need to make sure that you've got people to be able to deliver the actual services. And if schools are struggling to hire K-12 teachers, I'd have to imagine that many early childhood professionals are struggling to find qualified, high-quality early childhood professionals as well.
So what income sources do you think should be tapped to provide the kind of education that most of us agree should be available for young children?
The legislature's been very creative at increasing funding for early childhood from about $136 million in a core set of programs to over $306 million this year. So it's made pretty steady progress since fiscal year 12. Is it where we want to be? Nobody said where we want to be yet. And so somebody's got to say, what does that look like? How many families do we want to participate in home visiting every year? You know, we've poured money into the program and are poised to be able to spend a lot more now that we've figured out how to leverage Medicaid. So as the legislature's expanded money, many of these programs already receive federal funding. So we maximize the use of those federal funds. There's other federal funds that are very flexible that we can use for these programs. General fund investments we can use. Going forward, and the other, I think, thing that's really important is early childhood was a priority during our recent budget challenges. We didn't cut early childhood. My agency and a bunch of other agencies were taking 10+% reductions. So that's pretty extraordinary to go through that kind of revenue volatility, and the legislature says, nope, this is a priority. We are not making any reductions to these programs. Going forward, you know, last year at this time we were raising concerns that the state was writing checks we couldn't cash because we thought the Treasury didn't have any money in it. This year we think we're going to end the year with over 30% reserves, you know, $2 billion. And we're projecting having an extra $1.2 billion in general fund dollars to spend or do tax cuts in fiscal year 20.
Would it make sense to actually do more tax cuts? We've done so many of those. Hasn't that been the problem?
That is, tax cuts in and of themselves, solely tax cuts. I haven't heard any loud interest at continuing to do that. What you will hear in the legislature is a desire to do broad tax reform. And the reason for that is because we have developed a highly unstable, very volatile general fund revenue stream. We're more dependent on oil revenue than we've been in modern history. And, you know, I've seen in my tenure twice now, you know, state general fund revenues evaporate by over $1 billion overnight because of changes in oil prices. So there's a desire to figure out, and the other thing that has happened is that as we've done tax cuts, whether it's food, medical, those are the really big ones, whether it's corporate income tax changes, it's about 40 million. Those have all eroded the base for the gross receipts tax, which we rely very heavily on. And counties and local municipalities, as that base has eroded, to get more revenue, they increase the rate. And that tax is a very regressive tax that was never meant to be, you know, 8% or higher. and it causes businesses problems, it causes families problems. You know, it's very desirable. The legislature's got a lot of desire on a bipartisan basis to try to bring that down and broaden out the base. One, to decrease the volatility of it, because so much of that is coming from oil revenues, so that we don't have to appropriate money for early childhood programs, K-12, and then oops, you know, everything crashes and you got to come back and make other changes. If you looked at our revenue forecast going back to 2004, it's like this every year. You can't do long-term planning and make long-term strategic investments when you're having to constantly do solvency measures. So I don't see on the horizon a desire just to do straight tax cuts, but that's always an option that the legislature has. Here's new money. You can either do tax cuts or you can spend it. Rarely do you want to save recurring dollars, but there will be probably some of that. So you'll see that being part of the conversation this session, and what that looks like could be everything from, you know, rolling back the income tax cuts that we did during the last session. The medical industry is largely outside of the tax code, and yet we're spending $6 billion on it through Medicaid. And you know what they would end up paying, the federal government would pick up 70 to 90% of the cost. So that's going to be a common conversation. It's going to continue to be a hard one, but it's going to be easier to have a big cushion and take that risk than we did when they tried it a couple of years ago.
We know that some early childhood money is spent ineffectively, and some actually not at all. For instance, with the home visiting or firstborn program. And I wonder whether we need to fund additional programs or whether we need better oversight of the programs that already exist.
I would say both. Part of the issue with home visiting is the need for the administration, whoever administers that program, to really develop an action plan for how we're going to roll this out, because we know the needs are pretty significant, but what's our target? What communities have real gaps? Who's going to deliver the services? Do we really need 30 different home visiting providers? When we need to go into a new community, are we trying to set up a new nonprofit to deliver that, or is there a more efficient way to be able to quickly deploy services within that community? And then a supportive administration in terms of administering it, and not creating artificial barriers for providers to be able to draw down funds to serve families. And then to work with providers on, why are you having a hard time finding pregnant women in this state? I mean, there's, 25,000 kids are being born every year, and, we're only funding 2,000 to 3,000. Why are we struggling with this? And there could be very good reasons, and there could be other, reasons.
What's the LFC's role in this?
To push on the administration to make better use of the dollars and make sure that it gets out there and is well used.
There's been so much in the news about the shortcomings of CYFD, the Children's Protective Services Agency. Certainly we at Searchlight have been writing about it and will continue to be writing about it a lot. And I wonder what you at the LFC and others see as the shortcomings, the failures of CYFD. What are the problems of this agency that just seem so entrenched, and how are we ever going to correct those problems?
Specifically on Child Protective Services, the way that system is designed is fundamentally flawed. And we've poured money into it, and we're not getting any different results. And I'm advising my boss, why do we keep pouring money into a program that is fundamentally designed to fail? And how is it designed to fail? Many of these families walk through an income support division door long before they've ever had any struggles. They're struggling economically. That system is punitive. It says, you're poor, you need help, you need to sign this personal responsibility agreement, you need to go get a job, you need to do all these things, and oh, by the way, we're not going to really help you do any of those things. In fact, we'll make it hard for you. If you want childcare, you got to go across town to a different building, fill out an application, go through a different process. Oh, by the way, you need to make sure that your non-custodial parent pays child support, because we use that to pay for some of your TANF assistance. Now you go to the child support office and get part of that system. So you almost like create additional stressors on families that are struggling and asking for $180 a month. Some of them are struggling with addiction. Some of them are struggling with, how do you take care of these kids? I don't have a stable housing arrangement. And then somebody reports them to Child Protective Services that they've left their kid unattended when, they're high on opioids. Child Protective Services comes out and they say, well, we can substantiate it or we can't substantiate it, but either way, you need to go get your addiction issue fixed, and we'll close the case now. That person's not going to get it fixed on their own. They're struggling. They need somebody to help them. The addiction becomes worse. They get reported again. CYFD comes out. No, we really mean it. You need to go get some treatment for this. But here's a safety plan so you can keep your kids. And you might want to be careful about that guy that you're allowing to stay in the home now because you need his income. They come out again, and the kid's got bruises now. And then they decide, well, this safety issue is not safe enough, or maybe it is. Maybe they leave the kid there and they tell him, you got to kick the boyfriend out. Now you've created more economic insecurity, probably done a good thing from a safety standpoint. Leave the kid there. Drug problem gets out of control now. Now the kids are in real danger. Maybe something worse has happened to them. Then CYFD comes out and says, oh, we're going to take your kids. Now we're going to go to court, and in order for you to get them back, you need to go do all these things. Just much harder than what much harder than what the Income Support Office told them. We're going to send you to ineffective drug treatment programs. We're going to tell you to go get a job, go get stable housing, go to counseling for what you're taking drugs for, your underlying trauma that you may have. Go to parenting classes because you're so successful in high school sitting in a class that we're going to tell you to go back to a class and learn how to be a good parent. We're not going to model that for you. And then they do all that. And it's extraordinary because 65, 70% of the kids will ultimately be returned back home to their mom. And then we'll put the kid back there and then say, okay, see you later. And we've looked at the data, and you see the cases that make the data real. Kids come into contact with the system and families over and over and over again, and the state does nothing to help them or intervene. It waits until you have a crisis that you need to take a kid out of the home or the kid gets killed. We've got the highest repeat maltreatment rates, some of the highest in the country. So within 6 months of the state coming out and saying, yep, you maltreated your kid, usually it's neglect. Vast majority of cases are neglect. Yep, you neglected your kid. About 12 to 15% of the time of cases, CYFD will come back and say, yep, you did it again, within 6 months. Within a year, it's upwards of 30%. Over longer periods of time, it's even higher. The way the system is designed is fundamentally flawed and has to be turned on its head and redesigned for earlier intervention and assistance and help. And there's a whole suite of programs that exist that are being used elsewhere to do that, and the state has refused to do it.
So you said that you have advised your boss, David Abbey, to withdraw funding from CYFD.
No, I'm questioning why we would continue to pour money into a system that isn't actually doing things right for kids. And is that really the best use of taxpayer dollars? Or should we be asking for fundamental changes to how that system operates?
Can you just describe briefly what some of those changes might entail?
Well, the first thing is having people who are qualified to actually do this work do it. You can't just have anybody off the street go and do child abuse investigations. And even with related degrees, You know, somebody with a bachelor's in psychology is not trained or equipped to be able to do that. We've got a real need within the state to increase the supply of licensed social workers to do that. You can't just have licensed social workers, that's the bare minimum. These have to be the elite of the elite, to work with these kinds of families in many of these neighborhoods and communities that are really struggling. And you can't pay at or below market wages for people to do that kind of work. I mean, the MCOs swept up a ton of licensed social workers in the state when we had a requirement for our Medicaid managed care companies to hire these care coordinators, sit in an office and figure out how to coordinate Medicaid care. Do you want to do that versus going out in the Southeast Heights in Albuquerque and figuring out what's going on in a kid's life in a dangerous neighborhood? I mean, so that's the first place you need to start. The second is deploying really highly effective prevention and early intervention programs, starting with your high-need areas of the state. Those would involve saturating neighborhoods and communities with effective nurse-family partnership, possibly firstborn type of prevention services. There's a program that provides a comprehensive array of child abuse prevention and early intervention, everything from a public awareness campaign to home visits to parenting support groups to intensive in-home services. There's actually a home visiting program specifically designed and shown to have outcomes for families that are have come into contact with Child Protective Services. Right now we're referring families that come into contact with protective services to home visiting that aren't designed to deal with that outcome, that problem, and they don't have the curriculum. And so that to me is very dangerous to do things like that. And then you've got intensive family preservation services that have been talked about for years in New Mexico, where you have highly skilled and licensed trained social workers go in and work with families where there's imminent risk of needing to remove the kids. And when you invest in these front-end programs, you can get pretty good results. We've done it in juvenile justice. We used to not do anything until the kid got, really in trouble, and then we send them up to Springer. And then they teach them how to be a real bad person, and the kid would come back and do it again, go back to Springer, and then end up in the state pen. The state said, we can't keep doing this. We'd have about 650 kids up at Springer and down in Albuquerque, on average every month. We were bursting at the seams. And the state decided to start investing in families and communities and kids with evidence-based interventions. Also implemented a series of reforms on how we hold kids who get in trouble accountable. You don't wait a year to try them and say, hey, don't do that. Juveniles need to be worked with on, you committed a certain act, here's the consequence. They have to be very close together for that cognitively to make sense for them to change their behavior. So the state worked with local jurisdictions, Albuquerque, Las Cruces in particular, where you've got big populations that were sending kids to Springer, to say, here's how you hold kids accountable and don't keep them in jail for a year until you do that. Provide, again, evidence-based community educational programs, day reporting, family-based services to deal with the underlying root cause of what's causing these particular things. Now we've got about 130 kids that we need to incarcerate because of their actions every month. Dramatic reduction in the inflow of kids needing to come into a secure facility that is not going to produce a good life outcome. Our outcomes from our facility programs and reforms that we've done are actually some of the best in the nation. We don't talk about it often enough. Missouri is usually held out as the best in the country. Missouri's population of juveniles that they're incarcerating are not as high risk or high need as what we're dealing with. And kids are not coming back into CYFD system. They're not coming back into the adult prison system, within a 3 to 5 year period. So when you invest early, when you invest in things that work, when you work on doing it right, you can impact and lessen the damage and the cost for all of these other things. And that's where you get those big return on investment funds. They're from the prisons and juvenile justice. We spend $180,000 to incarcerate a youth per year. You can send them to Harvard for that. So we make a big investment in really expensive stuff that doesn't work, but you know, it costs maybe $3,000 to $4,000 to do some of these in-home services. So from a taxpayer standpoint, you should be asking, why are we not investing in things that work, that are cost beneficial, and that get better outcomes for kids and families?
Actually, that's 2 kids to Harvard, right? So during the Richardson administration, a child's cabinet was formed. That was,
The microphone, please.
really? Okay.
Me? Okay.
Yes.
Put it up a little bit higher.
Okay. I was saying that during the Richardson administration, we had a children's cabinet. And the head of that cabinet was, you know, kind of commonly known as the children's czar. She, in that, I think it was a she, kind of oversaw and intermediated between the various child programs and departments throughout the state. And I wonder what you're thinking, what your advice to the new governor would be about this cabinet. Is that something that the state would benefit from reenacting?
We're all about performance management. What? Did it? Did it turn off? May have gone off. Or can you hear okay? If I project, okay, I'll project. At LFC, we're all about performance management. We've got an elaborate system of measuring government performance and monitoring it on a quarterly basis. As staff, doing analysis around it, presenting to the committee. They're appropriating money to solve certain problems. Are those things getting solved? Are kids learning to read? Are they graduating high school? Graduating college? Are they safe? So we measure all of those things, but what we have a real challenge with within government is agency managers using that information to manage their programs. And a children's cabinet can help with that from an accountability standpoint on the executive side. If they're intent on solving certain problems for citizens and others that live in our state, then are they reaching what their goals are? And how do you do that? The children's cabinet is a really good forum to focus on those types of things. Our investments in a core set of early childhood programs have gotten so large that it may be time that we need to move those into their own cabinet department. In part because they're spread across 3, now 4 agencies. And that can become a real challenge from an administration standpoint, from a coordination standpoint. And the real challenge is all of those programs are really important. They're really important to the legislature. But there's also lots of other really important stuff that exists in each of those departments that sometimes detracts from attention on administrative issues within the early childhood services. So, for example, Children, Youth, and Services Department. What do you think executive management is consumed with over the last 6 months? Child Protective Services. Well, that's where a bunch of early childhood money is. How can you have so much, needed attention on Child Protective Services and also, this is important? That just becomes a challenge. Public Education Department. That's what, $2.6 billion. Pre-K's, a good chunk, not a good chunk of that. It's a very small chunk of that. They're not even school-age kids. They're not even statutorily part of our school system. So how do you give that individual program enough attention and with all the other competing interests that are going on within it? The Department of Health. They're running state hospitals. They're running public health offices. They're running the waiver for people with developmental disabilities, have been in a consent decree for 30 years with the courts, managing their day-to-day operations. But then they've got these, really important early childhood programs that frankly never, ever get talked about. So it may be time, because we've been making such a big investments, because The system is a little bit messy when you look at it in terms of kind of strategic decisions that we need to make. It may be time to organize some of those programs into its own department. That raises a host of hard policy questions. Where do you put pre-K? We split pre-K between the schools, and we split pre-K between private daycare providers. Why? Because that industry said, if you don't let us participate in it, we will go out of business and you won't have anybody to take care of your babies. So what do? You create a pre-K program in the schools, then you create a pre-K program over in CYFD for the daycares. They're supposed to be the same, but they're creeping into different regulations, rules. PED will put money into a community that they didn't talk to CYFD about, and now the daycare providers and CYFD system are saying, hey, where'd all the 4-year-olds go? So, that's not going to go away. That's going to be still need a challenge, and that's what a children's cabinet says. You raise that level up.
Yeah.
The lieutenant governor was the chair of that, and then Ms. Dudley staffed that cabinet for her to say, hey, the whole point of a cabinet is to coordinate, and let's have a focused coordination on that at the highest levels of agency. So it could, I think, be helpful along possibly with the new agency.
So much of what you've told us tonight has been really sobering. And I wonder, do you feel hopeful?
Absolutely. There's only 2 million of us. If we can't figure this out, then we've got real challenges. I look at the juvenile justice example that I gave you should make everybody feel really proud. Is that system perfect? Absolutely not. It's got all sorts of little problems that go on in it. But then when you look at our neighbors next door in Texas, they have 14,000 kids incarcerated, spread all over a large geographic area where they are getting abused in very bad ways in a number of different facilities. A very different government organization to be able to solve those problems between local governments and state governments. From a management standpoint, I feel it's a lot easier within New Mexico to be able to make pretty significant change if you have, people rowing in the same direction. A couple of years ago, we were looking at, I'll give you another good example. And I like to break these problems down into manageable bite-sized chunks because sometimes we get overwhelmed. We think they're too big, they're not manageable. High school graduation rates. A couple of years we looked at what would it take for New Mexico to get to the national average of 80% of kids graduating on time. It was around 2,500 kids. Across 400 high schools, Kurt, across the state? What would it take to get a handful of kids at each high school to graduate on time? Is that as hard as, wringing our hands about low graduation rates? There's actually just a handful of high schools that you would need to target within the state that have very low graduation rates. You can make a very concerted, targeted effort to say, hey, what's going on here? We know what works to get kids to graduate on time, even when they're behind. And we know that those schools, more times than not, are not implementing those things. What if we implemented what works? What would our conversation be about our educational system if within 2 to 3 years you can increase your graduation rate 10 percentage points? A couple of years ago we looked at third grade reading. Everybody was wringing their hands about not enough kids are reading at grade level. About 10% of the kids were one part of one question away from passing it. And we've spent an enormous amount of effort saying whether or not we should test the kids. What if we said, hey, how do we get one more kid in every classroom to get one more question right? What would that do? And you see these things all over government where, our teen pregnancy rate, it's actually not very many teens having babies. We know where they are. We know which geographic areas they are. We know we're not implementing evidence-based education programs within those communities. We're not making access to certain types of health services. If you could, in 3 or 4 counties, you could get to the national teen birth rate average very quickly. And that's littered all across government when you start breaking down these problems. repeat maltreatment and child protective services, all sorts of things. So that's what gives me hope. We know a lot about what works. Hopefully we'll have more partners in implementing that. Hopefully the public will demand that more as we know more about what works. And then keep working hard at making sure that we implement it right. And I think you can see pretty big changes within our state. You know, we challenged UNM a couple of years ago to double their 4-year graduation rate. And they said, can't be done. It's like, it's 300 students, guys. They've done it. More than doubled it in the last couple of years. We're not talking about it, unfortunately. But that saves students thousands of dollars. It's contributed positively to our economy because people are now out in the workforce working rather than either staying in school, paying tuition for 6 or 7 years, or not graduating at all. So, you know, those things can make really, small things can make pretty big differences. So that gives me hope.
Thank you. At this point, I'd just like to open it up for questions from the audience. And just please limit yourselves to questions of 1 minute and do frame it as a question. Yes, Larry Chandler.
Since I don't project well.
Do you want to have?
I can repeat it, too.
Take him a question to the microphone?
Is it on though?
I don't know, it should be. I didn't turn it off.
Okay.
Is it on?
No.
It's just quiet.
Says on.
I'll try to repeat it.
I will, so I'm a pediatrician here in New Mexico, and the New Mexico Pediatric Society, which is the state chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, has put together an agenda for New Mexico's children, which we presented to gubernatorial candidates. And part of that agenda addresses home visiting and early childhood. And in our agenda, we note that high-quality home visiting is available only to a minority of New Mexico's children. And so how do we support and develop a high-quality home visiting services? And we want to do this by 2020 for all those newborns in families insured by Medicaid. And currently, Medicaid pays for over 75% of the births in New Mexico. That's one part of the question on home visiting. The other part on early childhood, we're also...
Okay, well,
So the question centered around how to quickly expand high-quality home visiting and the role of Medicaid in that. We've long said that, you know, Medicaid's paying for about 85% of the births in the state. Medicaid should play a more dominant role in improving health outcomes for babies and moms, and is not doing a great job with that right now. The first thing to, I think, quickly be able to scale up high-quality home visiting, like a nurse-family partnership, maybe firstborn in rural areas, is to involve the medical community. Maybe the Health Sciences Center, Presbyterian, the managed care organizations that we're paying so much money for, charge them with the responsibility for standing these up in communities. The other option are hospitals. But the question is, do you want to have each community have different providers? Do you want to have part of the hospital system? Do you want statewide provider? Those are decision points that we need to think about, but those are ways that you could quickly deploy high-quality home visiting services.
Anna Maria Garcia.
I'm Charles. I'm with the Lano Foundation, and we've been working with early childhood for a number of years. And we understand the role that historical trauma or trauma has on children and families, and how if that trauma is understood by communities and providers and legislators, that when you are able to provide trauma-informed care, what a difference that makes. How do you think that as a state we can move toward that direction, as well as having necessary mental health programs for families moving into schools?
I think we're still at our infancy as a state of learning about trauma-informed care. And a lot of those is at a practice level, so it's hard to embed those things at a legislative funding level or policy level. But directionally, as part of an early childhood services department, being trauma-informed in how it does its business through requirements around training and certification and working with institutes of higher education to make sure those types of practices are embedded within curriculum across a number of different programs would, in my estimation, be important. Yes, in the back.
My name is Alan Kirk, I'm a municipal judge, and I chair our Juvenile Justice Advisory Council. It's our continuum.
Yep.
We get CYFD funding. The struggle when we get outside, away from the metro area in rural New Mexico, is dealing with your evidence-based programs. I think there's some phenomenal programs out there, but the lack of facilitators is huge. And what happens is when in the rural areas, when we need to find a facilitator, we're unable to use the funding we receive for training. So it puts the burden on the community or other funders to try to put together a train-the-trainer program. There is a huge, you have 21 continuums throughout the state who are struggling with this evidence-based program facilitation. Why wouldn't the state fund train-the-trainer programs for these evidence-based programs that are recommended to help the rural areas in the community or in the state?
It would likely be an important investment the state should be making in terms of helping stand up evidence-based programs and interventions. And oftentimes when I meet with program managers at agencies, they tell me things like, well, those train-to-train models are really expensive. We're using that evidence-based observation tool to see if a pre-K classroom is really high quality is too much. And in that case, I ask them, well, how much is it for a statewide program? And they're like $20,000. I was like, don't bother me with numbers that low. Go do it. This is a $50 million investment we're making. Same thing with juveniles. Sometimes we spread ourselves really thin and it makes it more difficult. So being sure that we're concentrating enough resources in a few things rather than a little bit of resources in a lot of things is important. But helping stand up evidence-based interventions in rural communities is important, and that's one of the reasons why we've been doing more cost-benefit analysis. It's like, look, you can do this really cheap program, Scared Straight, serve a lot of kids. It's really cheap to do. We don't have to spend a lot of money on it. Guess what? It doesn't work. Makes things worse. You can spend a little bit more money on a lot fewer kids, like multi-systemic therapy, but you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck and you're probably going to solve your problems within your community a little bit better. So bringing that cost-benefit analysis equation back to the table to say, look, investing in low-quality stuff's not getting us good outcomes and it's costing us more in the long run than investing a little bit more in things that work that are going to get us where we want to go from an outcome standpoint. So I'm with you on needing to pay for the infrastructure to stand these things up. And normally we don't advocate for overhead. Normally I'm beating on agencies to cut overhead. But when they can demonstrate that it's helping improve quality and implementing things that work, we're a little bit back off of that a little bit more.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Allen, and I'll just speak up. I'm a lawyer. I do. So I used to practice special education law, and then I had 3 children that all have special needs. And so have all received excellent preschool programs here in Los Alamos because of their developmental delays. So parents have often said, yeah, you can get great early education programs if you have a kid with a disability. So try to get that disability so that you can get a good program that's affordable and that's quality. Is there any way we can leverage those federal funds from the IDEA to better support our other programs?
The untalked about program that is partly funded by what you're talking about is actually through the K-12 funding formula, where the state puts in a lot of money per pupil for 3- and 4-year-olds to get services. How well those services are integrated into other pre-K classrooms throughout communities, it varies widely how those are implemented. I think we have to have more conversations about how we have a more integrated, inclusive use of multiple funding streams so that we're not segregating kids. Head Start, you got to be below 100% of the federal poverty level. So all the really poor kids are going to programs that are really struggling in the state. And why can't they go in a blended classroom with kids from the rest of the community, and we blend in pre-K money with Head Start money, with 3- and 4-year-old school money, with maybe a little bit of fit for therapy and other kinds of things. So getting administrators in the same room to figure out how do you blend and braid these things to make a comprehensive package, and then stand up local programs to be able to do that, is something we got to focus on as a state.
I can envision, a program where we have, every kid, in some kind of, is in some kind of program from firstborn right up to where he goes to regular school. So that kind of begs the question of all these healthcare providers, or these home childcare providers, are going to be out of a job, Is there some way to blend those people into the system?
Yes. Child care is our biggest early childhood program. It's $130 million. That's where we're spending all the money. It's an income support program where we're trying to make it high quality. It's not designed, nor is it demonstrated an ability to better prepare kids for school, provide protective services, do all these other health outcomes. But being in a safe, caring environment, nurturing environment has other benefits that we're probably not measuring as well. So they have to be part of the system too, because even middle class and upper middle class families, there's lots of 2-parent and single parent working individuals. You just can't make it on one income anymore. So you have to have a really high quality place for kids to be able to go within communities. So it has to be part of the system. Do you need to pay for the child care assistance for all 3- and 4-year-olds to be under those program standards, or do you want them to be following the curriculum from pre-K that we know works? Those are harder conversations that we need to have. And maybe those providers are the ones who provide it, because the schools locally don't want to serve 3-year-olds maybe in their community. They'll take on the 4-year-olds, but 3-year-olds might be a new thing, some potty training and lots of other kinds of stuff. So, that there needs to be a full continuum within a community for families to be able to access at their choice, not government telling them to have to do this, for really high quality early childhood interventions. There's not a lot of research about whether it makes sense for us to stack these interventions and make sure every kid participates in home visiting, high quality child care assistance, preschool, whether that's going to dramatically change the outcomes that we're seeing. But we're seeing some promising results when kids participate in pre-K and this extended learning program that the schools operate before kindergarten, where it's nearly closing the achievement gap for a small group of kids that have participated in. But none of these programs are really lined up in communities around the state to be able to provide those opportunities yet. And that needs to be part of the investment strategy, that you invest in these investment zones to make those opportunities available to families within smaller geographic regions of communities.
If you need a community to volunteer to line that whole thing up and make it work, we're here in Los Alamos today.
That's so nice.
One of the challenges we come up with, and you kind of talked about it earlier, was that creating barriers for families in accessing these agencies, whether it's early intervention, speech therapy, whatever have you, things like transportation, working with families and dealing with the fact that they may have multiple children, juggle between work and school. How do you get these agencies to kind of recognize some of the challenges families have in accessing these services?
You have to have a mind shift within the agency to look at people as their customer. They look at siting state office buildings where it's convenient and where it's available. Convenient for workers, not necessarily, and where it's available. Putting a Child Protective Services office outside of the Southeast Heights makes no sense to me. but that's where a big building was convenient for the state to buy. So that's a mindset change where, you know, communities have to say, no, we want you to locate and we want you to organize about serving our community and making it easier for people to access it. In fact, we want to hold you accountable for doing that through customer satisfaction surveys and performance management kinds of things. We also have to acknowledge local communities' own turf battles that exist among provider groups. You know, people are in the business of helping people, but they're also in the business of being in business. And sometimes that can rear its ugly head as we're trying to organize how we're going to deliver services within a community. So the state, as a very centralized funding and administrative organization, needs to recognize that it needs to work with local communities to design how that looks best, probably on a case-by-case basis. But starting with the mindset change at the agency of how do we organize ourselves, how do we design what we do to serve our customers to make sure that they're getting access to services that are actually make things better for people versus this is easier for me as a bureaucrat to do. This is my process, you need to do my thing. What can we do to help you? That's a culture thing, a leadership thing. That's challenging. In the back and then up front.
What can we do as parents to encourage expansion of the pre-K program that just rolled out this year? There was a wait list of 24 students that came in. My son got into it luckily, and he's performing great. But there's a lot of parents, and I don't think it would be hard to motivate us to do something. We don't know what to do. We need to expand that program so it includes everyone who wants to be in the program. And this year it was 24 on the wait list. Next year it'll probably be higher because it was new this year, so not everyone knew about it.
Right. So the state's been making a pretty significant, steady investment in pre-K. A lot of the, well, I'll be honest, there's a challenge. The CYFD administration thinks we should put all the money in child care assistance. They asked for $25 million for child care assistance, none for pre-K, for pre-K offered through the daycares. PED, under the same administration, said pre-K works. We want to go like gangbusters. Give us a big increase, which the legislature did. So that's where you need that coordinated executive saying, how are we going to roll this out? How many people can we responsibly absorb into the system? Schools got to have teachers to hire them. And make sure that more 4-year-olds aren't missing out on having this opportunity. So I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I suspect that you're going to see some pretty big investments in pre-K, but a lot of that money is probably going to be going into converting half-day programs into full-day programs. So it's not going to be buying more service slots, if you will, or number of kids that we can serve. Because we think there's a lot of 4-year-olds that are getting some sort of service. And there's a lot of concern over crowding out, $70 or $80 million of Head Start where they can't enroll anybody. And then communities with too much PED, pre-K, causing hardship for private providers. Things other than serving kids are getting in the way of doing what you're talking about.
So who do we go to? Because there is a lot of parents in Los Alamos that have recently moved here from other states that have all these problems, that also have good pre-K programs that are state funded. So who do we talk to move the ball forward? Because it's not acceptable here in Los Alamos, and we don't know where to have our voices heard.
So you can talk to your local legislator and your school superintendent about, what because they're the ones who decide whether to apply for the grant.
There are people that are thinking about leaving Los Alamos because of the pre-K and some of the early childhood options that are available.
Right.
And that's lab talent that you're missing out on. So
Right.
we're just trying to understand.
Yeah, and so the way this has been rolled out is the state's making available more and more money, and then it's up to local communities to apply to the state to get that. Some communities have moved faster and more aggressive than other communities have, and they're getting the programs.
Can I just answer that real quick? Do you mind? Los Alamos schools have applied for every pre-K funding we can apply for. We haven't been eligible until this year because the legislature focused on low-income communities, and this was the first time we were eligible, and we plan to apply to expand the program for next year, if the money's available from the
Yeah,
legislature.
we can talk offline, but I think there's room to expand it. Like, I don't know where the money's come from, but there's demand for it, and it's an issue. So, we need to discuss.
Oh, I wanted to follow up on pre-K and ask for, because I think lots of us don't know, is there a fixed curriculum? I mean, you're saying it works very well. So is that pretty much universal throughout New Mexico? And I also want to know, are pre-K teachers part of the school system, and are they paid as school employees? And then I also want to know if a children's cabinet would cover 0 through age 18, or how would you think that would work?
Okay.
Thanks.
So on pre-K standards, the state has actually set pretty high standards for its pre-K programs in terms of what its curriculum looks like, training. There's a national organization that has, their researcher that heads it was one of the researchers that developed some of these early childhood programs and has done 40 years worth of longitudinal studies, Steve Barnett. And so they've created sort of a framework of best practices that preschool programs should have. And we meet 9 out of 10 of them. Where we don't meet one of them is we do require licensed, bachelor's educated teachers in the public schools. We do not require that in the daycares. They are required to work towards some sort of certification. Oddly, and they get paid very different, because if you're a school employee, you're going to get whatever the school salary is. Oddly enough, we pay the same for both. So it's always been perplexing to me how we can pay, $7,000 for, per kid for a full day, and get, a licensed teacher in the school system, and get somebody making barely above minimum wage in a private system. And that's a real problem that we need to address. Children's cabinets likely look to 18 to 21. So they'd have to make decisions about subgroups within that to focus on. Is early childhood going to be a priority, this year or all years? What do you do with all the high school students and the focus on that? They'll have to prioritize if they do that.
To be determined.
Yep.
We need to move on now and break up into our table discussions. But thank you very much, Charles. I think this has been incredibly interesting. And now I'd like to introduce Billy Blair, who is the former president of the Santa Fe Community Foundation, which led discussions on key community issues. She was associate publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican and is now a consultant in media and marketing and public policy. She's chair of the governance committee at the Los Alamos National Laboratory Foundation, and here she is.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Mr. Salini, for your comments. The questioning and the comments have been so robust that we're falling a little bit behind time. Here is our goal, is now we have about 20 minutes instead of 30 for each table to have a discussion. You have a discussion leader at your table, and you're going to inform the Los Alamos League of Women Voters, the Los Alamos Association of University Women, and Searchlight on the 2 issues that you think are the most important in your area. And that is, what should the schools do? What should the governor do? What should the legislature do? You're sitting at one of those tables. We want to come to agreement on the top 3 issues for the league and for the association and for Searchlight. What has been added is enact laws for 0 to 5 education programs that are based on evidence of effectiveness, provide adequate resources for teacher training, pay, and curriculum. And then, I think this is a subset, am I right? Is this a subset of this? Fully fund 3 to 4-year-old pre-K?
No.
No, that's something, but they don't have any docs.
Just talk
Put
about
one on.
It's not working.
it.
It's going in now. Thank you, Jan.
Drive-through or
So these are something that you want to put, are these small dot items, fully fund 3-year-old pre-K and starting birth, because you can only pick 2 dots, whoever did that.
Issues that we thought were important
they are. So those are small dot items, right? Could you please put some small dots on them? Could you put some small dots on them now? Thank you.
Try this one.
Oh, I've got it in mind. Oh, could you please, I will put small dots on them. One of our young assistants will put small dots. Please, sir. Okay. Now, added under what we should ask the governor to do is, there was a group, a table that really liked A, and they wanted to add a subsentence that child care centers should be early childhood education centers. Okay, this got 3 small dots, being a minority report, and this is enforced standards for child care, strengthened if needed, have basic curriculum and training requirements, plus accountability. A table also added budget funds to raise teacher pay, and I think if they made a verb out of incentivize service providers to work in rural communities. For example, after graduation, reimburse student loans if they work for a certain period of time. Okay. Now, what should the schools do? 2 dots here for this first item. Should they be given responsibilities for early childhood programs with an addition of, and they wanted this added to their 2 dots, schools should coordinate with local providers. Here's another minority report which got a big dot, however, so we're accepting it as a major recommendation. More inclusion for children with special needs in daycare, ages 3 to 5. And here's one, a minority report on the minority report board with a big dot. Universities need to build a pipeline of high-quality educated teachers. So, let's address the first one. What should the legislature do? And what should the executive do? Like, so we have to address them all at the same time. And what should the schools do? And we can only select 3 of these. So, do you see items that emerged in the minority reports that you like better than what you saw in your handouts? And if so, what are they? Anyone? Does anything resonate with anyone?
Could you read the minority reports again?
Well, there's many. Enact laws for 0 to 5 education programs that are based on evidence of effectiveness. Provide adequate resources for teacher training, pay, and curriculum. That seems to be 2 separate items, really, right? Fully fund 3 to 4 pre-K, start at birth, and put money there. Okay, then there's budget funds to raise teacher pay and incentivize service providers in rural communities. And they came up with some examples of how that could be done. Here, more inclusion for children with special needs in daycare, 3 to 5. Universities need to build a pipeline of high-quality educated teachers. So, let's do it this way. Let's do it by show of hands. Do any of those, what we're going to call minority reports, I'm going to go through them again. If they resonate with you, and where are my counters? You're my counters, okay? If it resonates with you, raise your hand. You would like to make it a
Can you
major.
distinguish what you mean here by minority reports?
The ones that are handwritten in.
The ones that were added, that were
Okay.
not provided to you by the League of the Association.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. It is like the legislature, isn't it? Okay. So, how many people are interested in enacting laws for 0 to 5 education based on their evidence-based?
How many times can we vote?
Many times as you want. Who was that, Kurt? Okay.
We're in northern Mexico.
Always the bad boy.
Vote often. Vote early.
These are bad.
But he's out. What's the count?
I have 7.
No, there's more than 7 hands up.
Just in this rows.
Yeah.
So we've got 14 plus,
I got 24 total.
just 24 is the total.
That's what I got.
Thank you. Okay, 24. Okay, who wants to fully fund 3 to 4-year-old pre-K? Fully fund 3 to 4 pre-K.
So Billy, you're saying, this really isn't working because we can vote for everything. So why can't we only vote for 2?
Okay. What I'd hoped to have was a time that we could have a 20-minute discussion about what you had seen to come forward and decide which items you think are the most significant, the top 3. So let's go that way then. Let's start.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
One from each board has the top 3? Or do you mean they could 2 and 1?
3 altogether. All 3 could come from the same area. Okay? Okay. So let's just have a little bit of conversation. And I'll call some names. Because you asked that question, ma'am, I don't know your name. Mary Ann, but you were decisive when you walked up here. I saw you those dots. So, can you tell us what are your top 3?
Well, I can't because we only did the executive.
Well, you see the results of the others.
Well, yeah, but I didn't study them.
Okay. So,
I object. I think that these are all aspects of programs that we think are needed. And to just pick out 3 things is not right.
Well, my thought was, can't we figure out from each board what the hierarchy is
right.
of the things we have? Now, the thing I find strange is there are lots of blue dots on my executive thing that we put stuff on, and not so many blue dots on the others. I don't know how you guys.
There were more of you. This is a smaller group.
Okay, so let's do it this other way then. Here's what I see you saying, and please correct me. I see the people who looked at executive saying each and every one of these items are equally important.
Some have more dots.
No.
2, 2, 2, and this is
So are there 4 tables?
so this is, you're right. So there's the top 3 to ask the governor.
Yeah.
Right there, okay. Let's go to the next easy one. What should we ask the schools to do? Schools people, somebody speak up.
Okay, well, we thought that because of this real life example, that children 3 to 5 have to choose whether they receive daycare services or special needs services in the schools, because the schools won't often come to the daycare, or the kids are receiving daycare out of district.
Well,
No.
let me clarify that real quick.
Okay.
So basically, we have a lot of families that commute here, so we have a lot of families that live off the hill. If their child so happens to need services, once they turn 3, they are told you cannot receive it here because you are out of district, and they send them back to where they live. And those families are choosing not to give their kids services because they cannot figure out, how do I have a child off the hill and I work up here? And so basically our center, then we have children that are not receiving services. They are identified as needing services, and families are stuck. We're stuck. We're trying to do the best we can for them. Families are going to ask for an out-of-district status, and they're going to be in our district anyway, so why are we helping them now and giving them early prevention when you're going to end up with them anyways?
Okay, so can we read this one this way? I see that number 1, giving local schools responsibility for early childhood, getting support, as long as it's a coordinated effort with local providers. And I see a support for Head Start and a support for getting special needs kids in daycare. Can we call those our 3 here?
Yeah.
Okay. So few dots in the legislative arena. Budget funds to raise pay for, somebody struck out teacher and put in for qualified early education teachers. So we're not just talking about any teacher, we're talking about early. And recognize services and responsibilities at the state and local level. And I'm not sure that we didn't get an answer. Nobody wants to establish and fund a separate department. These folks didn't say that. They said they want instead laws for 0 to 5 education that are evidence-based. And then they have a subset of increasing teacher pay. So those seem to be the 3 things here. So, league, association, would you be happy knowing that you have 9 marching orders and not just 3?
Oh, yeah.
You okay with that? Okay. Now, here's the part where we are going to do some counting. And you heard Charles Salee talk about this. Just how do you want to pay for this? Okay? This was our hidden charge. Okay, and this is where we really are going to count you. You're familiar with the Yazzie case, Judge Sarah Singleton's decision saying the state is failing our children in education, and it has until April of next year to do something about that. So the judge suggested in her, 84, 87 page ruling, several ways. So here's where you can vote, certainly more than once. And would it be easier for our counters if people stood? Okay, stand. Okay, who wants to access the general fund?
I think you should read them all.
I'll read them out. Access the general fund, the land grant permanent fund, the severance tax permanent fund, increase or restructure gross receipts taxes, increase the progressiveness of income taxes, reinstate the healthcare industry tax, slow or reverse the corporate income tax reduction, and repeal the capital gains tax deduction. Let me just remind you, because sometimes we all get confused about that the land grant permanent fund is the one that was established at statehood in 1812. That's the big gorilla. That's the one that pays off $500 million a year that supports public schools, universities, hospitals, and the state penitentiary. And the severance tax fund is smaller. It's funding out about $200 million a year, and it's for its own, the severance of oil and gas and other minerals from the state of New Mexico. Okay, so that's the difference in those two. Yes, ma'am.
Could you add another item that was...
I surely can.
That would be, the speaker referred to the duplication of services and because of lack of coordination, that fell under different agencies. If there was a reorganization, that might save a good deal of money that could be reapplied.
So a reorganization to save money, so that's not, that is a revenue source.
Reorganization of services, not money necessarily.
Yeah.
And you all know that you have a copy of this?
Yes.
Okay, there's a copy on your table. Okay, who wants to access the general fund? Who wants to access the land grant permanent fund?
To be clear, this means the...
The land grant is the...
No, I know that. It means not the income from it, but the fund itself. The corpus. The corpus.
The corpus. It means going into the corpus, that's right.
So,
remember we had that vote back in whenever, and for 3 years, we would be taking a higher percentage out, and that's sunset.
2003.
2003, thank you.
A point of information.
Yes, sir.
The increase in, or restructuring gross receipts tax, the increase progressiveness of income tax, the slowdown of corporate income tax, and the repeal of capital gains would all go into the general fund.
That's true.
The 6 through 8?
Six.
Five.
But it wouldn't go into the general fund unless they first did those.
I think what the league means to say by this is increase general fund funding to provide these services. In other words, instead of it's less than 50% now that goes to education, up that to, am I right about that, Barbara? Up that to 50 or 55% or something, or whatever amount is in it. I think that is a separate point. So how many would access the land grant permanent fund? How many would go into the corpus? Yes, ma'am.
I would, I'm voting in favor.
Oh, there's one vote.
Okay, well done.
Which one are you on?
Two.
It's on your table as well. Seventeen. How many would access the severance tax permanent fund? Remember, not quite so much money there.
But that's not. You can just want all the money.
4. Okay. Increase or restructure gross receipts taxes.
Well, you guys aren't in business, that's for sure.
After Mr. Salee just told you how regressive our gross receipts taxes are.
Restructuring.
He says restructure, that's right.
One proposal for restructuring was to lower the gross receipts tax and broaden the base.
And broaden the base, that's right. And start taxing hospitals that are not now taxed. Okay, how many hands do we have? 17. Increase the progressiveness of the income tax structure. You remember there was an income tax break back when Governor Richardson was in office. Higher incomes, taxes went down by almost 50%. That makes probably you. 14. Reinstate the healthcare industry tax. 1, 2, 3. Slow down or reverse the corporate income tax reductions. 3, 4, 5. 12. Repeal the capital gains tax deduction. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then reorganize to save money. Reorganize departments.
Stop duplication.
And stop duplication of efforts. Thank you. We'll reframe that. Okay. So, the most support is accessing the general fund, and we were going to reframe this to reduce duplication in order to save money and use it more effectively. We'll rephrase that. So, what we learned is that, yes, you want local schools to have responsibility for early childhood education programs, provided they coordinate with local providers.
That wasn't actually, that was a separate thought. We didn't really go for that number one when we put our dot up there.
Well, then that's coming out.
Not for the schools to do all that work, but just to coordinate with those.
Local providers to do that. That's good. Okay, I understand. High-low for Head Start for children, and high-low for more inclusion for children with special needs in daycare. With the governor, we want the governor to do everything here that the league said. Boy, we better get the governor to get busy on January 1. And what should we ask the legislature to do? We want to budget raise, definitely, we're hearing that it's a recurring theme, aren't we? Let's raise teacher pay. Let's incentivize teachers. Let's find ways to get teachers into underserved and rural areas, which is something that Charles Solis spoke about. And reorganizing services at the state and local levels, and getting a I'm sorry, we didn't get votes for that. Enacting laws that are evidence-based, and again, we're talking about teacher training, pay, and curriculum. So I would say that teacher pay, training, because that was one we had as an extra over here. This was a minority report that says universities need to build a pipeline of highly qualified educated teachers. So that is actually one item. Let's get teachers from our universities who are well qualified, who'll stay in New Mexico. Let's give them incentives to stay in New Mexico. And I think this group even added, let's do things like help pay some innovative ideas we've heard. Let's help pay off their student loans and things of that sort. And let's make sure that we budgeted those funds for teachers, which is done, remember, for the most part, at the district level. So, that all said, now all we have to do is go out and convince the legislature, the governor, and the schools to take action on those things. So thank you very much for your participation. Thanks for being here tonight. Thanks to the League, to the Association, and to Searchlight for this great conversation and ability to learn from Charles Solis. I hope you have a very good night.